Hello and welcome to this brand new Blender Smoothie tutorial. My name is Ben Amond, and in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to create this planet using two programs, Blender and another application called Wilbur. And we're going to be using Wilbur to create the terrain maps for the planet. Now as you can see, maybe you can't see, but I'll post the final render for this on my site so you can see it a little more clearly. But we've got some erosion effects going on with the terrain on here. You can see where sort of rivers have run through and maybe where rainfall has caused the rock to erode away, and it looks a lot more realistic than anything you could come up with using Blender's noise tools. Or really anything in Blender to try to simulate this, short of maybe manually painting it. So it's a really, really useful application, and it really helps with creating planets and landscapes and makes them look really realistic. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. I'm just going to minimize out of this. Before we get into Blender, just pull up Google and run a quick search for Wilbur software. It should pull up one of the top links here. I'm just going to go to current Wilbur version. Now, here's the downside to the program. It's only for Windows. And it looks like, yeah, there, Windows 2000 or XP or Vista. So because of this, in order to help make sure that everyone can follow along with this tutorial, I'm going to provide a folder on my site with a bunch of different generated textures with different random seeds that you can use, as many as I can upload, hopefully, at the time that I have available. So you can follow along with this and you have a lot of options to choose from. Because a lot of the maps, really when you're working with them, they do end up looking the same, short of just some displacement and where the noise is. So I'll upload a couple versions of those for non-window users to work with. But you would just come to this page and download the Wilbur 64-bit or 32-bit setup program, and you would install it typically the way you would install any other program. And what might throw you if you're not paying attention is the folder that the application is stored in once it's installed. You would have to go to your start menu there and pull up all the programs that you have installed, and you would want to go to your program files folder, and it would be under a folder called, let me pull it up right now, let's go find that really quickly, program files, under Slayton software, which is really weird because you don't really see that anywhere on the page, at least it doesn't stand out, so it's kind of weird at first and hard to find if you're not looking out for it. But once you've installed it, you should track down that folder, Slayton software, open up that file, and the application should be inside. And you can create a desktop shortcut or pin it to the taskbar or whatever you want to do from there. Yeah, so once you've installed that, we can go ahead and close this. Let's go ahead and open up Wilbur to begin with. So when we open it up, we start out with this sort of little blue-green tile. And we want to get rid of this because, first of all, it's too small for us to do anything with. I think it's 512 by 512. And we want something much bigger, more like, go ahead and go up to File and click New. We're going to do 2048 by 2048. And we can go Next, Finish. Alright, and this is a much, much larger image, so this will be much better for what we're working on. And you may want to do an even larger image than that if you're going to be rendering a super, super close close-up of the planet that we're creating. I wouldn't recommend too much larger than this because even on my computer it kind of lags a bit, and I built this computer specifically for working with large files like this, simulations and images. So let's go ahead, and the first thing we want to do is add some noise to start with. And a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be doing here, I really just pulled from the Wilbur site. They have tutorials listed on the site. If you go there, you can check those out. It's essentially the same thing. We're just covering this in the video so that we have the files all ready to go if you want to follow along here. And then we can work with them in Blender from there. So I'm just going to go up to Filter and hover over Noise, and we'll choose Fractal Noise. Now, if you've used the Landscape add-on in Blender, you may recognize Ridge Multifractal as a noise feature often used when we're creating mountains, something like that. I know that Andrew Price used it in the Nature Academy, I'm pretty sure, with his mountains, and it's pretty much the perfect noise shader, or not shader, noise setup for a landscape like this. So we can leave all the default settings the way they are. Don't have to change any of those. We can just click OK. And as you can see, it's generated a nice colorful fractal noise image for us. So the very first thing we want to do is we sort of have this set up. We want to go up to Filter again, choose Fill, and Fill Basins. So we go ahead and click OK, leave that at the default value. And as you can see, it sort of filled it up. It looks like they poured water over it or something to sort of cover up the lower areas. And this is important because this is going to help with the erosion process, because it needs, I'm not entirely sure how the programming behind it works, but we're going to be filling this again repeatedly, pretty much after every step, to make sure that all the erosion processes work properly. So if you're following along and something doesn't look right or it's not matching up, it's probably because you forgot to do this step at some point. So the next thing we're going to do, now that we have these flat areas that we can have some rivers running along and everything, we can go up to Filter and hover over Noise, and we'll add Percentage Noise this time. And what this does is, I'm just going to bump this up to 5%, is it's just going to add sort of a very light noise scattering across all of the image. And this isn't going to be like the fractal noise that we have there. It's going to be like really fine noise, almost grainy. So if I click OK, you can see what that looks like. So that just adds some nice texture to this. And that's pretty important later on in the planet, because there are some smooth parts and it doesn't look very realistic unless you have this sort of noise spread all over it. And then we want to go back up to Filter, hover over Fill, and fill the basins again. Click OK. I believe this is set as a shortcut key for all of the version, or yeah, for the program in general. If you just press Control B, it should pull that option up. So we can do that from here on out. So the next thing we want to do is hover over Filter again, and we'll go up to Erosion this time, and we want to choose Incise Flow. And what this is going to do is it's going to simulate all those really cool river shapes that we had going on before. So it's basically going to simulate riverbeds is what it looks like it's doing. And this takes a little while to load on such giant maps as 2048 by 2048. But we'll just wait for that to load. And this is probably the most important tool that you want to use when you're working with this. Alright, so it pulled it up, and as you can see, the rivers look really realistic. They branch out really in a very realistic manner. So this is what's going to add most of the realism to this. To start with, we're going to create some simple river beds before we create actual sort of sharper rivers in the middle. So to do that, we're just going to add a little bit of blur to this. And it's kind of confusing because there are all these different blurs. In this case, we want to add a post blur. So we want to blur everything after we change all the settings. So we'll start with the amount here. We're going to change this from 1 to 3. And we can click Preview to sort of see what we're doing. And so you can see that sort of helped branch the rivers out a little bit more. And we're going to adjust the flow exponent. Let's try, I think 0.35 was the factor that had listed in one of the tutorials, and it works really well. If we click Preview again, it adds a lot more rivers there. I wouldn't recommend doing anything, I can't remember if it's higher or lower. Let's try 0.15 and preview that. Oh yeah, I wouldn't recommend doing anything lower than that, because you might get you'll get too many rivers going there, and it looks really chaotic. So about 0.35, maybe a little higher than that. And we can turn up the effect blend as well. I think it's actually turning it down. The effect blend is basically how much this is visible. So the lower we have this, then the more it's going to blend in with the background. So it was at 1 by default, and it's really strong. We set it to 0.25, then it sort of fades out a lot more. The trenches aren't as deep. And now we can finally add the post blur. Set that to 2. Click Preview. So as you can see, it really blurred out those areas, and then we can go in and add the sharper river parts later on, and that really helps create a more riverbed type feel, which helps in the planet because, go ahead and click OK. When you're zoomed out really far, sometimes you can't see the detail of the more narrow ones, so this helps with that. And we want to go back up, press Control B to fill those again, and click OK. Again, you want to make sure you do that after every single step, otherwise you're going to run into some problems. And we'll go up to Filter again, hover over Noise, not noise, erosion, incise flow. Again, wait a really, really long time for it to open. Alright. After we've moved on with this part, creating the sort of sharper rivers, then pretty much be done, and we can convert it to a height map and bring it into Blender. Did I click that properly? Yep. Alright, there we go. And we want to set the blur, set that a little bit lower, a lot lower actually. We'll try 0.3. Click preview. So they're back down to their sort of more narrow shape. And as you can see, it looks a lot better. They fit right in with the blurred out areas that we had before, and it looks a lot more like a natural sort of riverbed. And we can turn down the effect blend a little bit too to something more like 0.15, so they're not quite as deep as that. And the flow exponent, could try lowering that. Let's try 0.1. That's a little too much. We'll try 0.15. That's good. And we'll lower the amount to 2 as well, so that they're not branching off quite as many times. Alright, and we can go ahead and click OK. And that's really all we have to do on the terrain generation. So we can see we've got some nice riverbeds, and sort of the red and white areas, we've got some nice mountain-looking shapes. And it looks really cool, really realistic. And so now all we have to do is go ahead and convert this to a height map that we can use in Blender. Not really a height map, I guess, since we're going to be using it as a bump map instead. But we just want to hover over texture here. Go to Gray Maps, and choose Height Map. So now it's converted it to a black and white height map. And we can go ahead and go up to File, Save As. And I have a folder set aside for this on the desktop right here, Planet Textures. And we'll just name it Height Map. We'll save it as a PNG file. Alright, and once we're done with that, we can just go ahead and close out of this. No need to save the changes, we won't be coming back to that. Okay, so the way we're going to do this, since we're using cycles, first of all we're going to delete the cube, and we're going to delete the lamp too, because we'll add our own later on. I'm just going to press Shift-A, and we'll add a UV sphere. You know what, let's delete that, let's add an icosphere instead. I just prefer the icosphere over the UV sphere, because the rings and sort of the top on the UV sphere kind of looks weird since they all meet at a point there. And all the triangles in that area, it looks weird, especially when you add the subsurf modifier, which is what I'm going to do now. And we'll turn the levels up to 2 on both of those, just to make it a lot really smooth in here. We'll try 3 actually. I'm going to turn on optimal display too. And basically, the way we want to map this, the way I've mapped it, is using box projection mapping and turning up the blend a little bit to sort of blend it together. And that's not always optimal, because you don't really have much control over where different parts of the texture go. But in this case it works just fine, because we're just scattering the terrain over this sphere. And whenever you try to use, sort of unwrap it using sphere coordinates and other things like that, you get some weird distortions up around the top in different areas, and it doesn't really work on the icosphere either, so it's generally the best way to do it. I'm going to press Shift-A too and add a plane, and we'll just make this our sun lamp. I want to scale it down, rotate it a little bit. And I'm going to go into rendered view so we can sort of preview this. We'll go to the shaders panel here, add a new shader. We'll just name this material sun, turn up the brightness, give it a very slight yellow tint, and we'll change this from diffuse to emission. Bring up the brightness to about 100. Alright, a lot more than that, maybe 1,000. That works pretty well. 1,100 maybe. Try 1,250. We'll keep it at that, and we can always tweak it later. Alright, so I'm going to right-click the sphere to select it again. And I'm going to split my view and change this top window to the node editor. And I'm going to add a new shader, and we'll just name this Planet. And basically all we're going to be doing is we're going to be using that texture that we had as a bump map, and then we're going to mix 2 colors together and use the height map to mix the 2 colors so that as it gets higher, you get closer and closer to a different color, and as it gets lower, then the same happens. So let's go ahead and press Shift-A, add an image texture, go ahead and click open, go to the desktop, planet textures, open the height map, and we just want to plug that right into the displacement. And nothing shows up right now. The reason nothing shows up is because we have to tell it to use generated coordinates. I'm pretty sure Cycles uses UV coordinates by default. So we'll just press Shift-A, hover over Input, Texture Coordinate, and plug Generated into Vector. And it looks really, really horrible, stretched really terribly. But if we change this from flat to box, we start to get a little bit of an improvement. But there are some sharp edges here, and it doesn't look quite right because it doesn't mix very well. So we just got to turn up the blend a little bit to sort of smooth those out to about 0.1. Oops, 0.1. And that's really all you have to do. Generally what I do from here, because sometimes you get some weird mirroring shapes, I think it's sort of doing that right here, is I just double tap R to rotate it on sort of a trackball type rotation, just to get a random part of the sphere that's not mirrored, and that helps make it a little more random and a little more realistic. But really that's all we have to do to map it, and as you can see it worked pretty well. Something else you might consider doing is cropping the height map image that we created. And the reason I still created it at 2048 by 2048 is because it adds the noise relative to the size of the image. Or not relative to the size of the image, but it doesn't apply the noise relative to the size of the image. So it helps to create a giant image and then crop it sometimes later, because as you can see right now, really all you can see are the riverbeds and you can't see the deeper parts of the river. So it just kind of looks like we've got a blurry texture on there. It looks kind of weird, so you might go ahead and crop that. You can do that in GIMP, Photoshop, Paint.net, whatever program. I'm going to go ahead and do that now really quickly in Photoshop. And like I said, this will just clear it up a little bit so that it's a little sharper, because it does look really blurry when we have that. I'll open that up. Crop it. Shift. Something about that size. And I'll kind of reposition that. Put it something more like that. Will work pretty well. Alright, I'll go ahead and hit enter, and we'll just save it over the old one. So yeah, that helps. I'll just go ahead and open that up again, and we'll go into rendered view. And as you can see now, it is much better. It doesn't look as blurry as it did before because we can really see some of the details in there. Alright, so the next thing we want to do, like I said, is add some color to this. So I'm just going to go ahead and press Shift-A, add another diffuse shader, and we'll change the colors on these to whatever we want. Press Shift-A, add a mix shader, and combine these two together. And we'll plug this image texture into the factor. And I'm going to make this first one, I don't know, I want sort of a dirty, kind of sandy color. Maybe make this one a little darker. Something sort of like that. Because I kind of like that sort of reddish brown color, almost Mars-like. We'll turn that down a little bit more to make it a little darker. Maybe something more like that. Might try flipping them around too, just to see how they look the other way around. I kind of like that better. Maybe make that a little bit brighter. Make that a little bit brighter too. Something like that. And it's a really subtle effect, but it really helps sell it. Because you can see sort of the mountains and those higher parts are a little lighter than the rest of it. I guess you might try making that even brighter and increasing the contrast even more. But right now what we have there, that's pretty good. Make that a little more red just for the sake of it. Alright, something else I did in the final planet is I added some sort of polar ice caps. And I'm going to go ahead, before I forget to do this, I'm not going to forget to do it, but I might as well cover it now. Go over to the World panel, click Use Nodes, and we'll set the background to black, just so that we can really see how this is going to look if it were in space. I'm going to position the camera too, sort of find a good spot for it right about there, something like that. Press Ctrl-Alt-0, position the camera, we'll sort of move that out. And I'm going to kind of rotate the camera a little bit. Now, it does look kind of weird because there's absolutely no light whatsoever in the shadowed part of the planet. Generally, there would be a little bit of light. I guess it would depend on the planet, but in this case, the atmosphere would still carry some of the light from the sun, so we would still have a tiny bit of light there. So, to simulate that, I'm just going to go ahead and press Shift-A, add another plane, and I'm going to move this over kind of out of the way. Double tap R to rotate it on a trackball. Sort of move it around and position it so that it's able to sort of reflect light back up onto the sphere. So that if I go into rendered view now, as you can see, it's not completely in shadow anymore, and that looks much better than it did before. I'm actually going to kind of move the sun lamp over a little bit, I think. Go ahead and render that again. That's a little better. Alright. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's focus on the polar ice caps. So basically what I did here is I used a gradient texture to add these, and let's go ahead and merge these for now because we're going to be UV mapping this a little bit. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to split my window here again and change this one on the right to the UV image editor. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a new image. Click OK. Doesn't really matter what it is, we're just trying to get some UV coordinates down so that we have UV coordinates to apply to the gradient. Before we actually do this, I'm going to split my view here again and open the node editor. And I'm going to move these out of the way a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and press Shift-A, Texture, Gradient Texture. And we're going to change it from linear to spherical. And set the coordinates to UV, plug that into vector. There's actually probably no need to do that, because like I said, I think it uses UV coordinates by default, but just to be safe. And I'm going to go ahead and mix this with a lighter colored diffuse shader, using this gradient as the factor. So now if we go into rendered view, it covered the entire thing, and it looks horrible because of that. But that's just because we haven't given this any UV coordinates yet. So let's go ahead and press Shift-A, or not Shift-A, Tab to go into edit mode, and I'm going to press Z to leave rendered view. And I'm just going to go into front view, press U, project from view. We're going to sort of scale that up a little bit. And now I'm going to go back into rendered view so we can really see what we're doing here. And basically, I'm just going to scale all of this kind of in real time, and I'm actually going to flip these around, put the white diffuse shader on top and the dirt on the bottom, because as you could see, it was sort of, that's what it was sort of doing. It had that circle in the center, which is what we wanted. Maybe I'll scale that down a little bit more. Maybe I'll scale it up. Let's see how this looks. And it's really just sort of moving it around and hoping that it falls into the right spot. And we'll just keep kind of moving that around. Well, let's try, instead of spherical, we'll just try linear. I tried it before and it looked kind of sharp and weird. But let's see if we can't kind of get this to work. Looks like it's sideways. Let me just rotate this 90 degrees then. Rotate it a little bit more. And again, I'm going to flip these. I guess I had them right the first time. Just like that. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and add an RGB curves node. Press Shift-A, color, RGB curves, to really bump up the contrast on this. There we go. That's a lot better. Alright, that's much better. And you don't want the gradient to be really sharp, because it just doesn't look natural that way. We want it to be something like this. We also don't want it to take up too much space. Maybe something more like, That's not working very well. We'll try that, and we'll just keep sort of moving this around until we get something like that. Maybe I could sort of scale that down a little bit. Oops. Scale it down. There we go. Just something like that should probably work. Just sort of move it around until you get something that you're happy with. That's good enough for me. So I'm going to press Tab to go back into object mode. And something else I really like to do that helps enhance the realism, especially with those mountains on the top, is to sort of do the same thing we did with the previous colors, where the higher a texture gets, then maybe or the higher the height gets, then it changes to a different color or different texture. So I'm going to go ahead and add a mix shader. We'll go ahead and mix this with the previous one using this image texture as the factor. Only in this case, I'm going to duplicate this RGB curves node, and we're going to use that. I'm going to kind of move this down. You probably can't see the nodes very well. Drag this over. Alright. So I just added the RGB curves node there, connected our image texture to that, and then I'm going to connect that to the factor of the mix shader there. And now I'm going to move this up, and we can sort of tweak where these curves are going. Something like that. So as you can see, it's already kind of working there. Maybe we'll get something a little bit more like that. And we don't want this to be too strong of an effect. We want it to be pretty subtle. But just something so that it's not some bizarre, perfectly shaped ring around the top there. Maybe I could kind of move that back a little bit farther. So that's working pretty well. Something like that really helps enhance the realism. Maybe move that forward a little bit more. Alright, so that works pretty well. And that just adds a nice additional touch to the planet, especially since we're going to be adding clouds to the atmosphere, so it needs to show some sign of water for the type of clouds that we're adding. Yeah, so I think that'll work pretty well. And we don't have to really worry about the South Pole in this case, because it's kind of in the shadows and towards the bottom. If you wanted to do that, probably the most efficient way would be to create a gradient image. Maybe use GIMP or Photoshop or something to sort of combine two gradients, so you have a gradient in the top and a gradient on the bottom, sort of forming two bands, and then you could UV map it to that. But in this case, we're only going to be worrying about this top part. So yeah, we're pretty much done with that. The next thing we're going to do is start working on clouds. So I'm going to merge this just so I can merge these. And the clouds are super simple. All we're going to do is select the sphere, press Shift-D to duplicate it, scale it up a tiny bit, something like that. Press Tab to go into edit mode, E to extrude, S to scale that up a little bit. Not too much, just something like that. And I'm going to save this before we go any farther. Call it Planet Tutorial. Alright, and I'm going to split my view again to bring up the nodes. I'm going to try to make them a little bigger this time, because I think I had them way too small the last time. I'm going to make this material a single user. We'll name it Clouds. And we're going to delete all this stuff, because we don't need any of it. All we're going to do for this is we're going to create a mix shader, a diffuse shader, and a transparent shader. So basically what we're doing here, I'm going to press Shift-A and add a texture, a noise texture, is we're going to use the noise texture as a factor to mix the diffuse and the transparent. So we're going to get some cloud shapes using this, and then mix it with this so that the transparency shows through and only the clouds are going to be visible. So I'm going to start with a scale of something a little bit lower, maybe 4. I'm going to bring the detail all the way up. We'll plug that into the factor, and let's just take a look and see how this looks before we do anything else. And right off the bat, it doesn't look very good at all. It's because we need to add an RGB curves node. And we just want to put that between the noise texture there and the mix shader here. And we just want to click and drag some points to really sharpen up some of these clouds. And just sort of move them around until you find a spot that looks pretty good to you. That'll probably work pretty well. Now, this is the last touch that you want to add to the clouds, and this really, really helps sell the realism, is this distortion factor on the noise texture. It basically just swirls the texture, and it makes it look so much more like actual clouds. So if we just press 1, will probably be a pretty good value. And then we can sort of move this around a little bit more until we find something that works pretty well. Maybe we'll try a different scale too. Let's try something like 6. That's pretty tall. Try 4 again. I'm just gonna sort of slide these around a little bit more until we get something that we're happy with. And I'm gonna double tap R on this too, to rotate that along a trackball, because that can really help. And you can just sort of rotate it around until you find some clouds that look good enough. And you'll just sort of keep rotating that. Maybe we'll rotate that up a little bit. Try something like that. That'll work. I'm going to turn this up a little bit more, maybe to 1.5. And now we've got some really nice cloud shapes starting to come in there. That looks a lot better already. And I'm going to sort of taper that off a little bit to give them sort of more of a softer edge there. Don't want too soft, but something like that works pretty well. I'm going to move that over a little bit more. That over a little bit more, so we have a little less cloud in there. But yeah, that actually works pretty well. So as you can see, they really look like clouds, and it's really this distortion factor in here that helps with that, and getting the right settings, or not the right settings, but about the right distance between points here on the RGB curves node. So if I can sort of zoom out a little bit so we can get the whole thing in frame. That's really all we're going to be doing on that. Let's see here. I'm going to kind of use the trackball rotation thing again a little bit more, move that up a bit. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Alright, so we're done with the clouds, and the clouds look good on top of all the rest of this. The only other thing left to add in the viewport is the atmosphere. So I'm going to press Z to go into wireframe view, and I'm going to select the inner sphere again and duplicate that. Sort of scale it out to something like that. And you want to make sure that these are really close together, pretty much as close together as you can possibly get them, because otherwise you get some weird rings around the sides and it just doesn't look very good. I'm going to split my view again and go to the node editor, make this shader a single user, and we're just going to name it atmosphere. Again, delete all of that stuff, we don't need it. And we're going to set up a similar shader to what we had for the clouds. Shift A, add a mix shader, combine those. Shift A, add a transparent shader, plug that into there, and a diffuse shader, plug that into there. Only this time we're going to choose a nice color for the atmosphere. Maybe make that a little darker. We'll start with something like that, and we'll just see how that looks. Only this time, instead of using a noise texture to mix them, we're going to be using, under input, a Fractal node to mix them. And I'll plug the factor into the factor there. And we're just going to try 1.5. We'll round it up a little bit. I'm going to zoom in, and we'll go into rendered view. Let's see how this looks. Alright, right off the bat, it looks horrible. And the immediate reason for that is this is casting a shadow on the rest of the planet. So to fix that, we can come over here to the object settings by clicking on the little orange cube icon. Scroll down to Ray Visibility, open that tab, and uncheck Shadow. And it looks like might have this backwards. So I can plug the transparent in first and the diffuse in second. Yep. And that was the second problem. Alright, so right off the bat, it looks a little too green for me. I'm going to make it a little more blue and maybe a little lighter as well, till I get sort of the color I'm going for there. And that's pretty much it on the atmosphere. Looks like... wonder if I can go into rendered view. Sort of press S and scale that up a tiny bit more and see if that does anything. And yeah, that works pretty well. So that's essentially it for the atmosphere. You can see also that the plane that we have back there is sort of casting its light onto there, and that looks really good. However, whenever I've been working with this before, sometimes I run into a problem where I get this weird band on the side. To fix that and the ray visibility, just turn off diffuse. And that'll just take care of any weird effects it might have on the planet underneath it, using that and the shadow options, disabling both of those. Alright, so I'm going to zoom out, and before I do anything else, I'm going to change the brightness of our sun lamp, because I still think it's a little too dim. I'm going to maybe make it 1,500. Maybe even higher than that. I might try 2,000. And that's already much brighter. It looks a lot better. Yeah, that's probably a pretty good factor. I'll try 2,150. When you get it too bright, though, you'll have to go in here to the other plane, add a new shader, and you'll want to sort of decrease the brightness of that. Because if you get the sunlight too strong, then that plane starts bouncing a little too much light. So we don't want that shadowed part to look too bright. We do want it to look pretty shadowed. And that's pretty much it for that. So we can go ahead and merge these two windows, come over here, go down to sampling. We'll maybe set that to something like 25 samples for now, just as a quick test. We'll go ahead and click render. And we'll check and see how this looks in the final render. Looks like I do have a little bit of a weird band going around the planet, so I think my atmosphere might be scaled out a little too far. But the compositing we're about to do might also help with that a little bit. So we're going to be blurring the edges there a bit. Alright. Yeah, so that works pretty well. And really, the only other thing we have to do then is work on the compositing. So we can just switch from the default window setup up here to the compositing setup. I'm going to merge these lower two windows and then merge these. I'll turn on Use Nodes and Backdrop. Set these apart. Shift-A, add a viewer. We'll plug those in. And right from the start, I'm just going to go ahead and add a blur node. Change it to fast Gaussian. Plug that into the viewer so we can see how much we're changing it. But I think I'm just going to go with something like 8 by 8. And I do want this to be a nice blue atmosphere, so I'm also going to add an RGB curves node. And go to the blue tab, the letter B there, and sort of bring that curve up to really accentuate that blue. And then I'll press Shift-A, add a mix node, and we'll mix both of these together. Maybe change it to add, set the factor to 0, sort of move those out of the way so we can see it a little bit better, and I'll start with something like 0.25. And that gives it a nice sort of atmospheric glow. To really efficiently add a nice glow to the atmosphere, it's easiest to just take it into a painting program, again like GIMP or Photoshop, and blur it from there, because you can work with layers a lot more quickly, and it's generally a more efficient way to work with things. But in this case, really we can just work with these glow nodes a little bit and get a pretty good result. Might try lowering that a little bit to 6 and 6. Maybe increase that a little bit more. We'll keep it like 0.3. Yeah, maybe 0.25 will work. Maybe we could try screen. Nah, there's not really a difference between that and what we had before. Alright. Maybe try 0.3 now. That works pretty well. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial. After some minor compositing, again, I would recommend if you really want to get a really good looking atmosphere to bring it into a painting program like GIMP or Photoshop and kind of work with it there, and you can really bring out a very interesting looking atmosphere compared to this. Go back to default, and I'm just going to switch this from render result to viewer node so we can see it. And yeah, it looks pretty good. So I'm just going to save this as a separate file really quickly in the Planet Textures folder. Let's name it Planet Tutorial. And yeah, that's it for this tutorial. So thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something from it. And as usual, I'd love to see your final results from this tutorial, the planets you come up with. And yeah, that's it. So again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.